Hi, everyone. This is Aaron Larson, executive editor of Power Magazine, and you're listening to the Power Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Rich Powell. Rich is the CEO of CEBA, which is the Corporate Energy Buyers Association. Rich, thank you for joining me. Please tell a little bit about your group and what you do.
Great. Well, first, Aaron, big thanks for having us here on the pod. I'm big fan of the whole platform of the pod and the magazine and everything, and appreciate everybody's time in joining us for this conversation. So, CEBA is the business association that represents the very large corporate energy buying community, and we are united in a mission to activate energy buyers and their partners to drive low cost, reliable, carbon emissions free global electricity systems. So we're a business association. We do the full suite of advocacy in the policy space on behalf of our members here in Washington, D.C., where I sit, and also in venues all around the country, in PUCs, RTOs, IRP processes, utility engagement, state legislative engagement, etc. We're also active globally in a number of markets. We also do quite a bit in the corporate voluntary buying space. So we think a lot about the standards and processes and rules for energy attribute certificates and environmental attribute certificates and all that nerdy stuff that supports the architecture that is corporate, particularly corporate clean energy buying. And we convene our industry quite a bit as well around these topics, all in the pursuit of enabling more transactions and more deals to happen in this space. Collectively, our members, as of the end of 2025, had procured north of 130 gigawatts of carbon emissions-free electricity in the US, and about double that again around the rest of the world. So, the folks on the listeners will know that that's a heck of a lot of power. That would sort of make us, having us, trend toward sort of California plus Texas sort of scale capacity in that system. And probably the last thing to know is that we cover all kinds of carbon emissions free electricity in those numbers and in our membership. So we've got solar and nuclear, we've got wind and geothermal, we've got hydro. New last year were gas with carbon capture deals and fusion PPAs as part of that mix. So if it's carbon emissions free, we like it.
That is a fantastic explanation of everything you're covering. So, do your members all feel the same about the different technologies that you're going after or that you're helping to facilitate? For example, do some specifically want only renewables where they're talking wind and solar? Others are happy with hydro. Others are happy with nuclear. Or is everybody kind of just looking for anything that's carbon emissions free?
So at CEBA, we're big tent institutionally, and we're also big tent in embracing a whole lot of different perspectives across the organization. So we do have some folks that framed their procurement goals as renewable procurement goals, and those have been mostly solar and wind procurements that have gotten them there. We have folks on the other end of the spectrum that are just totally open and are buying energy of all kinds across the mix. Some of those, I'll call them the clean, firm energy sources that are a little bit newer in this mix and in this conversation. Some of those are growing really rapidly. So if you look at our 2025 deal tracker, you'll see that, we procured just about, these are round numbers, just about 20 gigawatts of solar and just about 5 gigawatts of nuclear in 2025. But, as the listeners of this will know, capacity factor adjusted, gigawatt hour per gigawatt hour, that actually means we're about on par between solar procured in 25 and nuclear procured in 25. So the rise of these clean, firm technologies to become sort of kind of rapidly co-equal to, what maybe people traditionally thought of as clean or traditionally called the renewable technologies, like primarily wind and solar, is happening pretty fast. And that's just because, look, there are we we need every electron we have out there, and ideally as many of those electrons as humanly possible are clean. And so a lot of folks are just realizing that they have to open up the aperture and embrace a broader portfolio in the mix here, because there are simply only so many solar projects that could come online, only so many wind projects that could come online. So if you're not even looking at hydro and geothermal and advanced nuclear and uprates to existing plants and all of those other options, you're dealing with a pretty narrow set of opportunities right now, and those are heavily subscribed opportunities, which obviously we're seeing through the pricing that's coming through, which is going up and up and up for PPAs for solar and wind in particular. People are now thinking a lot more flexibly.
Mhm. And your membership includes some of the largest energy buyers, which is why you have these huge numbers as far as gigawatts where you can compare yourselves to Texas and California. How have data centers factored into this surge in electricity that's being demanded by your members? Is it something that is top of mind, and how has that shaped conversations in recent years?
It's a great question. And so our membership covers the entirety of the big electricity buying sector. So, our founding members, for example, we're a company with a lot of data centers, Google, but also Walmart and General Motors. And so, as recently as sort of 2009, 2011, Walmart was the biggest electricity buyer in the country. That was then surpassed by Google, which now been surpassed by Amazon, which in some sense is a business model that's like Google and Walmart put together. And so we represent that whole range. On our board alone, we do have all of the hyperscale data center operators and then a number of their partners who are running colo data centers or manufacturing their chips and other things. But we also have advanced manufacturers. We've got some of the largest agricultural interests in the world, major petrochemical players that are using huge amounts of electricity, both in their refining and even in the hydrocarbon extraction business. And then we've got some of the biggest retailers in the country that have really really large square footage and store space and distribution centers and all those things and a bunch of folks that I'm sure I'm missing. And so we represent everybody. And the facts on the ground are that the deepest concentration of new demand coming in the system is being driven by really a couple of our members. So the hyperscale data center operators and the folks that are developing these frontier AI models that demand an enormous amount of electricity on top of just the background growth of the internet. We sort of forget that there was, even before AI, there was all of this data center growth baked in just from everything else, just from basic use of the internet and expanded digital streaming and use of social media and digital twins being rolled out across all of the things that were driving internet growth even before AI baked into the system. And then on top of that, you add the tremendous new use from both training and inference for large language models, and now you're talking about some real load that's being added into the systems, alongside. What we still see is, I mean, it has slowed, although who knows what now happens with the trajectory given the increased price of gasoline, with the tragic circumstances and the war in the Middle East at the moment, how durable that is. But we are also still seeing a significant increase in load due to vehicle electrification and then industrial electrification and then residential electrification. So I mean, there still are four categories. Data centers are by far the biggest of those categories right now, and we do have those players in our membership.
You mentioned the Googles and the Amazons, and some of the announcements that have come out are around nuclear specifically for these types of hyperscaler data centers. That we've seen or heard about restarting plants such as former 3 Mile Island, which is now, I guess, Crane Energy Center. And you've also mentioned uprates as well. Of course, that's happening at any of the nuclear plants around the country where they're adding upgraded turbines, for example, to get more output. But when it comes to things like small modular reactors and advanced reactors that aren't really at a commercial point yet, do you see that coming soon, or what's your view on the new technology that's being potentially rolled out?
Well, so I'm a longtime nuclear advocate. Before CEBA, I spent 10 years with an organization called ClearPath, which is very involved in the federal legislation and policy at DOE that has enabled this kind of growth in advanced reactors. And I'm proud to also be a board member of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance that's very focused on these issues as well, NRC reform and all that sort of stuff. I'm very optimistic that we're going to have actually a suite of technologies, certainly by 2035, perhaps sooner, that is commercially available and commercially competitive as an additional terrific tool in our broad toolkit here. And so I hope all of these things work and work well. Our members have now made bets on a portfolio of these things. So, as you just said, Aaron, we've done it all. So we've brought retired reactors back to life, as we're seeing with Constellation and Crane Generating, and as we're seeing with NextEra and Dwayne Arnold by Microsoft and Google, respectively. We've extended the life of existing reactors. So, companies contemplating that big leap from 60 years to 80 years, the whole subsequent life renewal process, the big capex requirement that's committed into that second life extension. We've had a lot of people, Amazon and Meta in particular, working with both Talon and Constellation on those life extensions. We've had people facilitating the uprates as well, as you just said. Getting that other 10% out of the plants, real megawatts in there. But so then the question is, what about these future reactors? And so across Amazon, Google, and Meta, our members have now made bets on X Energy, Kairos, TerraPower, and Oklo at significant scale. So at hundreds of megawatts to gigawatt scale, in some cases multiple gigawatt scale. And so I think a very strong demand signal has now been sent for those technologies. Anybody who follows those closely know that those are really different reactor types. So we got a high temperature gas reactor in there with X Energy. We got a molten salt reactor in there with Kairos. We've got a sodium cooled fast reactor in there with TerraPower, and we've got a micro reactor concept in there with Oklo. So a range of really different technologies. I think eventually this market's going to be large enough that there's going to be room for all of those folks and likely more, alongside robust expansion of both gigawatt scale, AP1000 type reactors and light water SMRs like GE Vernova's X300. I think we're going to have a large enough market that all however many I just named, six of those companies are going to struggle to keep up with the amount of demand that's going to come in through the space. But the good news is if one or more of those does not pan out, does not become commercially or economically viable, we're not betting everything on one reactor type of one technology that's going to come through the system. And they do fill enough different niches, like take X Energy and the high temperature gas reactor concept. That also has significant applications in industrial heat. For example, Kairos and the molten salt reactors could play a really distinctive role, both as a power generating asset and as something that could sort of help us with the nuclear spent fuel recycling process. So they all potentially play interesting and different roles. If you're looking for like speed to power on those, it's hard to argue that the micro reactors, which are arguably certainly the smallest, if not also the simplest to build and assemble, might have some advantage on speed. In that, obviously, maybe sacrifice some economies of scale for the speed, and that the light water versions of those things, like the GE Vernova X300, which we already see large versions of that up and operating. One's already under construction with Ontario Power and Gas up in Canada, so people are actually going to be able to look at something soon. And obviously, they've now just announced a big partnership with the U.S. Department of Commerce and our friends in Japan to do a very large deployment of them with TVA. So I'm hopeful now that there's a whole suite of these things that our members are going to be able to choose for offtake.
When we talk about the pace of growth around data centers, a lot of people are lamenting the fact that it's outstripping the ability to build new generation and transmission and the bottlenecks that we've seen or hear about. How do CEBA members think about their responsibility when it comes to that equation?
Yeah. So big picture, we know that America and our amazing utilities and grid operators and energy generators can grow at these rates because we've done it before, right? So the rates of growth we're talking about historically are actually not anywhere out of the realm of the kind of growth rates we were able to achieve in the 90s and the 80s, and they pale in comparison to the incredible growth rates we had in the post-war period, 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? Now, granted, all those were growth off of a smaller base, and we have had this sort of 20-year, arguably Goldilocks moment where economic growth became decoupled from electricity demand growth due to efficiency incentives and all the things that we did, primarily driven by U.S. federal policy in the 2005 and 2007, kind of big energy acts that, effectively required every incandescent light bulb in the country to eventually be replaced with an LED and all those things. So we are out of practice on growth, and so we are somewhat painfully, just like exercise is hard after a long break. We're somewhat painfully getting back into shape around this, and obviously the particular nature of the growth of some of these loads is very different than what we've seen historically. So it's unlike in the past where growth was very distributed across the entire economy. We're seeing growth happen in these pockets with these very large, in some cases, multi-gigawatt scale loads, which there really isn't a strong analog for, previously across our economy. I mean, even very, very large manufacturing or chemical facilities, other things. I mean, you kind of have to look at things like maybe an LNG export facility, most of which actually self-generate and are grid connected to actually see like a multi-gigawatt load somewhere around the system. It's also, by the way, happening in the data center adjacent spaces. So the new chip fabs that are going in are also new multi-gigawatt loads. Again, also, a little bit new under the sun. And interestingly, actually, in some ways, an even greater challenge than the data centers themselves because of the exquisite power reliability requirements that a chip fab has. Where even like a multi-second blip can lead to hundreds of millions of dollars in recalibration costs for these unbelievably finely tuned machines to make the chips that go into the data centers. So kind of that collective load between the data centers and the chip fabs for the data centers is new under the sun in our system in terms of the intensity of the pockets on the grid. And so it's kind of fewer individual states and utilities that are having to deal with this really intense load growth forecasts than we'd seen previously. That's new and different. Our members acknowledge that. And so we're doing all kinds of things to try and help. So, I think that across the country, and this was sort of recently memorialized with the president at the White House in the Ratepayer Protection Pledge. 5 of our members and a few other companies that are very involved in all this collectively signed that pledge and said collectively that they were going to make sure that the way they worked with grid operators and utilities and PUCs around the country was to pay, frankly, more than their fair share. So they said, very firmly, we're going to pay all the costs to serve us, and we are going to help with the costs for grid scale transmission and distribution upgrades, which will actually ensure that all ratepayers don't suffer, but indeed benefit from these new loads coming into the system. And so it's not just about paying their fair share or more. It's also about adding new load as the denominator into these systems so that the costs of transmission and distribution can be split across a broader, pool of demand hours. Obviously, we know that in a lot of regions of the country that have some of the most intense data center activity already. So take, the Dominion grid of Virginia, we actually see very affordable power rates by and large for ratepayers in that jurisdiction. So we see examples of where data centers can sort of net help overall energy costs in a region. So we kind of know that example. Our members are committed to carrying out those sort of affordability policies nationwide. And then behind that, the place that CEBA spends most of its time thinking about is the scale of the new carbon emissions free energy that's coming into the system as a result of what all these companies are doing. So they're coming in with these massive procurements for new carbon emissions free electricity of all characters. And, it's sort of breathtaking in its scale. I mean, last year was our largest year ever of corporate clean energy buying. We hit 27 gigawatts of contracted volumes in 25. it appears S&P is reporting, this is not our deal tracker yet, but S&P is reporting that in Q1 of this year, Q1 alone, 17 gigawatts were contracted in the first quarter of this year, which would certainly put 26 on track to eclipse 25 as the biggest year ever, and just shows the massive scale of the new resources that our members are causing to be brought into these systems.
You just talked about how important reliability is. You talked about the way that your members are trying to keep costs down. You talked about the amount of carbon emissions free power that's being added to the grid. Now, those three things are kind of what your mission is. You're looking for low cost, reliable, and carbon emissions free power. How do your members prioritize those three things? I can imagine that a data center, the reliability is the absolute most important thing. But how do you basically weigh those three items within the structure?
Yeah, I mean, we really see them as co-equal and mutually supporting, right? So if it's not cost effective, your CFO is probably going to, disagree about the ability to do the carbon emissions free. If it's not reliable, cost effectiveness doesn't matter a whole lot if it's not reliable in the first place, right? And obviously, if you're not doing carbon emissions free and you're not meeting the commitments that you publicly held your company out to, that can then have consequences with employees, with doing right by your various stakeholders, and frankly, with social license in the communities where you're building this this new infrastructure. So we really see it as three co-equal legs of the stool, where we're trying to aim for the sweet spots where we can hit all three of those legs together. I'm not going to say it's never challenging, or that those things don't come into tension in some cases and in some circumstances, but we're really trying to hit all three legs.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about things like capacity markets and resource adequacy requirements and kind of the broader reliability conversation that's happening at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for example, and what the different regional transmission organizations are doing, and how they're affecting your members. Can you touch on that?
Yeah. So big step back. CEBA has been big tent in that we have supported transactions in this space across all of the different market types and situations. And so we have found ways to transact in open competitive wholesale markets. That's been our largest area of transactions. And so the virtual power purchase agreement, through which well more than the majority of that 130 gigawatts has been transacted, is best done in an open competitive wholesale power market. In fact, more than a third of all of our contracted electrons, full stop, occurred in ERCOT. So as we think about like the perfect situation for us, it would be an open competitive wholesale market where we can sort of transact freely under that, and where there's a reasonable speed to power, like an interconnection system that's working reasonably well, and a well centrally planned transmission system. We're delighted by ERCOT's decision to further expand that transmission system this year, for example. So ERCOT to us is sort of like is the North Star, and we understand that not every part of the country is like ERCOT or ready to be like ERCOT, and so on the other end of the spectrum, we have also found ways to work with utilities on their green tariff programs. And sort of, we track the utility green tariffs around the country. We're delighted as they expand. We're delighted as there is innovation in that space. And so, two great examples are bring your own clean energy tariffs, or Beyonce tariffs, as we've charmingly named them. Amazing acronym. The first of these was just codified late last week with Georgia Power and the Customer Identified Resource Program. Our awesome acronym did not survive the combat of the Georgia PUC and the Georgia Power planning process. That's okay. We still like the program, the CIR, and so that's going to enable us to identify new innovative clean electricity projects that could be sited in the Georgia Power range, sort of bring those into the system, and then they will get included in and eventually sort of operated by Georgia Power, included in the rate base and all that, but will be the specific off-taker of those projects. So it's sort of a win-win for everybody in that, and we hope to see those kinds of programs expanded into into more jurisdictions. And then there's the whole thing in the middle with all kinds of other transaction bumps. I will say that now that in so many jurisdictions, our members' ability to get access to power, to get their own load interconnected is now becoming contingent on what they're bringing to the grid, like physically the capacity that they're physically bringing to that grid. And usually those grid operators are asking for firm capacity as the thing that's sort of getting somebody well placed in the interconnect queue. And understandably, because the grid is growing and firm capacity is what helps you sort of handle that growing grid. The distinction sort of used to be two different sets of transactions, one of which was an actual physical delivered power purchase set of transactions by our members to physically power their site, and another which was a virtual power purchase agreement, which was bringing the clean energy assets into that system and making sure that those two things were equal and equivalent in terms of the emissions, or said a different way, that one netted out the emissions of the other. Those are now increasingly breaking down as two separate transactions, as people now look to a single big transaction to cover both the firm physical capacity needs of supplying new electrons into a system and getting a deal that has great energy attribute certificates coming off of it as well. So that is increasingly why you're seeing interest in adding nuclear and hydro and gas CCS and these other things into these systems, because they're both a capacity deal and a clean energy attribute certificate deal. So that's probably the new kind of hybrid deal structure that you're starting to see from our members in more places, particularly in the wholesale markets.
Let's talk a little bit more about the avenue that you were just going down, which is about corporate PPAs and how that has helped and been a major driver of renewable build out. Where do you see corporate energy procurement headed in the future in, the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think we will see it'll continue to diversify across all kinds of different forms and models. The VPPA remains a strong, elegant structure which solves a lot of problems and helps utilities both with their corporate sustainability goals and managing their long-term energy price volatility risk. So that's what it has going for it. We do increasingly see these requirements from all of the grid operators around the country for more when we bring our load into the system. And so, that's variously that we've got to bring our own capacity into the system, or we've got to, pay some kind of specific large load tariff with a take or pay requirement, something like that. Or that we've got to bring flexibility into the system with us. And so I can imagine more and more investment on all of those fronts as our members diversify their buying. And the flexibility angle is actually really quite interesting. Not a place that we've had major corporate deal. I say major. There's been some corporate deal activity, some experimentation, some piloting, but there hasn't yet been a demand driver at scale for companies to come in and participate in those in a major way. Requirements on interconnection for flexibility would be that driver of corporate deal activity. And our hope is that those requirements are structured really flexibly and are based on performance, not on a specific technology or approach, because then all kinds of things can bloom under that, right? So if what you need is flexibility, if what you need is the reality that, we need demand to go down or stay flat in a particular moment, and that will avoid the need for us to do something really extraordinary or, pay for a whole new peaker plant to be built just to cover a couple hours of a year's worth of costs. You could then see our members investing in, what we call a traditional on-site demand-side management. So really cool concepts like Emerald AI and other things where you take a data center, you can actually scale down the work, the energy requirement of the workload of the data center. You can also imagine on-site energy storage for other clean backup gen on site, which could, the data center could temporarily switch over to a bunch of batteries or a hydrogen fuel cell or something like that on site. You can also imagine, Aaron, to your initial question there, broader investments in virtual power plants and other things, so that the flexibility is being provided by these large customers, but on a grid level basis via investments across the whole grid, in a fleet of VPPs, or a fleet of distributed batteries or something like that. So I think there's going to be a lot of innovation and diversity across how folks approach this in the coming 5 years.
And how have tariffs and trade policy and the supply chain disruptions been affecting your members and their ability to meet their clean energy targets?
Well, for better or for worse, we're seeing this is very bipartisan. This is cross administrations where we've seen a steady ramp up in the level of tariffs and trade protections, which has made the imported components in these systems more and more expensive, and that is on top of the legacy ripples we continue to have from the tragedy of the COVID moment and what that did to global supply chains, in terms of just driving up all costs for components, tariffs or not. So all of that collectively has led to significant inflation in the costs for new contracted, frankly, energy of all kinds, clean and traditional energy. If you take a look at the terrific work of our friends and board members, I should note, Level 10, who are sort of the primary platform on which a lot of people transact their power purchase agreements, both market and transacted power purchase agreements in this space, you'll see in their public reporting that the numbers are up and to the right. We're paying a lot for these PPAs for both solar and wind. I think we were up something like 9% for solar year on year between 24 and 25, and 16% for wind. Round numbers, it's called 10 for both. And that's been a long-term trend now. So we are paying more for these PPAs than we have since sort of the first days of the first Trump administration. There's been kind of just steady escalation since then. And that does mean that this is an intimidating challenge. Now that has happened alongside an inflation in the prices of all energy. So, the days when you used to be able to, acquire a combined cycle gas turbine for 75 cents a watt, and then run it affordably at $2 an MMBtu of natural gas are gone. They're behind us. So, gas is at least 4 times that expensive on a capex basis now. Thankfully, the gas itself is only 50% more expensive than that now, but it does mean that running those plants is still, especially new build gas plants, when you can get the turbines, is still by and large more expensive than the PPAs that we're covering for solar and wind. But it does mean all in, it just everything's a lot more expensive than it was, and that's just a reality of where our country has gone with trade policy and domestic industrial protection.
And I'm sure you're talking with policymakers and lawmakers, legislators regularly. What's the one thing that you wish they might understand better when it comes to large energy buyers and what they need from the grid?
Well, I'm like a broken record on this one. I have a single answer, which is they need to understand that if we are going to keep national electricity costs affordable and reliable, we're going to make them increasingly carbon emissions free, we need fundamental reform to our national energy and environmental permitting system and to our transmission planning system. We need that, and we need it at a federal legislative level so that we lock in protections that, for example, in this administration, we've seen really significant changes and streamlining to how things like NEPA or the National Environmental Policy Act, which is sort of a permitting architecture under which all kinds of different tests and processes and analyses are run for virtually any new federally connected, certainly energy infrastructure, really any infrastructure. And we've seen significant administrative changes made in this administration, but those things won't be sticky unless they're codified in legislation going forward. And there's a whole lot of things that any one administration can't do, like reform how we do the judicial review of these findings and permits. There's also significant changes that we need legislation for in both transmission, particularly transmission planning, so like mandatory transmission planning around the country at the very least. We also need better standards that apply to all technologies around energy permitting certainty. So, folks that are allocating capital need to know that if they've gotten a permit and the plant's under construction, that permit can't be yanked, or a permit can't be unduly withheld if it's passed every significant, test and threshold and hurdle along the way. And that's going to benefit energy infrastructure of all kinds going forward. So that's what folks need to know. If we're going to do all the remarkable things that we could do, from meeting this new economic moment and building out this incredible high-tech infrastructure and keeping our country safe and beating China economically in the AI race, we fundamentally need to reform those processes here in DC, and then we need to do matching things in a heck of a lot of states and jurisdictions around the country.
Mhm. All right. Well, Rich, this has been a really interesting conversation. I've learned a lot about your group and what you do. Again, for listeners, I've been speaking with Rich Powell, the CEO of CEBA, which is the Corporate Energy Buyers Association. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you think would be important to touch on before we wrap up?
I really appreciate the time. I appreciate all of your terrific listeners' time. Thank you for having us on. Thank you for everything you do to cover and elevate the conversation in this space. Thank you.